In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Christ is risen. That's a nice, solid, truly he is risen. That was good. It always makes me feel good when people they respond, truly he is risen. You hear some baritone in there, you hear some high voices and everything in between. That phrase, Christ is risen, is the most extraordinary phrase and the most extraordinary fact in the history and the life of the church. One of the things that I wanted to speak about today, I spoke about a little bit during Holy Week, but I really wanted to spend just a couple more minutes on it to explain something about the fact that where do we hear those words first? Now, you might be thinking, well, where do we hear Christ is risen first? We hear it at the tomb of Christ, right? The angel says he is risen, he's not here. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He's not here. And I was having a conversation with someone this week who was asking some questions about the church, and one of the things that came up in our conversation was the tomb of Christ and really the interior of the church. In a properly designed and adorned Orthodox church, everything in the church would speak to the theology of the church. Every single aspect, from the way the church is designed to the way that to the icons that you see, to the posture of the icons, and the way the icons are written, all speak to the theology of the church. But there's one thing I wanted to spend a few minutes on today, which is, again, in every Orthodox church, and you see it every single Sunday, you see it every single service, you see it at the front of the church, and there's two things as you look in the altar that you typically see. One is missing today because it's right out here. Number one is the cross, and the second is the altar table. The altar table is the most, if you want to say, important liturgical object in the church. We can't do a service, we can't celebrate a service without an altar table. In fact, if you even look at some of the other sacraments of the church, the wedding service, right, has a small table here in the center, but it also has the altar table where many of the parts of the wedding service are celebrated on the altar table. In a baptismal service, it's the same thing. We have a side table usually set up for some of the supplies that we need during a baptism. But communion, at some point in time in the baptismal service, the priest again goes in front of the altar table. There is no altar without an altar table, period. And there is no celebration of any service, a sacrament of the church, without an altar table. Now, what is the altar table specifically? Well, the altar table has many developments through the history of the church. One was to be on 4 pillars, so they had the 4 pillars, and the bishop, when he would come, would put the 5th pillar in the center of the altar table to represent that the hierarch was the one who held up the church. Well, our altar table has also 5 pillars, but when the bishop comes, you don't see him walk in with a giant pole to stick underneath the altar table, because it's consecrated, the church is consecrated, and that has fallen into disuse, the ability to change the altar table or to add or subtract things from the service. Plus the fact that the bishop would go around to different places where there was no clergy and serve, and now churches function 365 days a year in the absence of the bishop's immediate presence. A supervisory presence, he's always there, but in the immediate presence, the bishop is not present at every service, and you know that just from being here today, that there's no bishop here. So how would we celebrate if we were dependent on that one pole underneath, that one pedestal? So the altar table is paramount in the serving of the church. The priest faces the altar table. The priest does not ever turn and just start saying, this is all about me or the priest. The priest is facing the altar table, praying on the altar table. Inside the altar table, as you may or may not know, you can see it as you come into the foyer or the side door, and there's that big, large photograph with Metropolitan Yakovos washing the altar table and also placing the relics inside the altar table. But there's a little box in the center of the altar table that has the relics of the 3 martyrs inside. It always has 3 martyrs as a remembrance of that the church is built on the blood of the martyrs. That's why the carpet is red in the church as well. But St. Haralambos right there with the long white beard and the red vestments, his relics are inside the altar table. In the far back of the church, next to the ladder, just to the left, is St. Boniface, and his relics are inside the altar table. And right next to Foti over there, if you point to the wall, Foti, the 40 martyrs, their relics are inside the altar table. And also St. Kyrikos, who was a young boy, a very small boy who was martyred, his relics are inside the altar table as well. So we actually have more than just 3. The 40 martyrs, some of their relics were placed in at the time of consecration as a special gift to the church. But as you know, we have the relics of St. Athanasios that just came to us this year. His relics you will never find in a church altar table. Never inside. You will never find it. And the reason for that is he was not a martyr. So it's only the martyrs that go inside the altar table. Now, one of the things that happened in the early days of the church was you think about it, the apostles went from place to place. They went from town to town. They prayed. They would celebrate the Eucharist or the Last Supper, what we would call like the Divine Liturgy, the early days of the Divine Liturgy. But they would also move from place to place and pray in different areas. Now, how would they do that? Taking an altar table, right? If you had to take an altar table and you had to have a table, this Last Supper table, right? Even the first, excuse me, the first Holy Communion was celebrated where? At a table, at a supper table. So if you don't have that, if we were to do a service, say outside for whatever reason, or if we were, I don't know, say we were traveling across the country by foot and we wanted to stop and we were walking on a Sunday morning and we said, okay, we want to have a liturgy, then there's one thing that has to accompany the priest, which is this, okay? This is called an antimens. Typically in the early days of the church, when the priest was ordained, he received his vestments, but he also received this. Now I'm going to open this up for you so you can see what it is, and you've probably recognized what this is, right? What is it? It's the epitaphion, right? It's a smaller version, right? Here's the small version. Here's the one that you're all familiar with. Seeing, flower. This is the one you're familiar with seeing, right? That goes inside the cavuklion. It's the same image if you look at it carefully. Do I have this crooked? It's the same image. It's Christ laying in the tomb. So what happens with this is the priest would bring that with him, bring this andimitsion, as it's called, antimens, and he would open this up on a table and then was allowed to celebrate the Divine Liturgy on whatever table this was placed on. Now, if you look at this carefully, it's a little difficult to see, but you'll see that there's writing all over around the edges. And at the top here it says, Archiepiskopos Konstantinopolios ke Neas Romis, which means the Archbishop of Constantinople and New Rome. And then it says the Ecumenical Patriarch, and it says what their name is on there. I wish I had one more hand. But it says the name. Actually, I can get another set of hands on the side. And I'll kind of point out to you, just stand this way so you don't block anybody. Here it says Archbishop of Constantinople and New Rome. And then it says an Ecumenical Patriarch, Demetrius. So this is from Patriarch Demetrius, by the hand of God, and then it has the year. From the Patriarch in the month of July, it's July. You can see there's some burn holes in there too. If you see light coming through, that's why we don't use this one, because it's fallen into disrepair. It's also signed here by the metropolis signs it here, and they usually write that it's given to the church as on the date and to the church that it's given to. This one was one that was borrowed because this particular Andimitsion, that's good. This particular Andimitsion was from St. John the Baptist Church. So we have this. So this was before the consecration of the church. This one was given. We have this one in the back, stored properly so that it doesn't get damaged or anything. But you can see on there, there's also some spills of the body and blood of Christ on it. And you see that the four evangelists are in the corners. You see the ladder and the cross, the tomb of Christ. And this is always opened. So when we say opos hypotokratosu, you remember that part? This is opened up. So after the gospel reading, right now, when I go in there and I move the gospel to the back, and I turn it and I make the sign of the cross, I open this up. This is laid on the altar table open. Then the next part of the liturgy is when we come out with the chalice and we put it on top of this, right? And then after communion, when we say always, now, and forever, we put it back this way, and we put it back on the side. Then what's the next step? Is we fold it up. So it's folded up, it's placed, it's got kind of like a triple fold thing there, and then the gospel sits on top of it. At all times, and in every hour, as the liturgical would say, the gospel is on top of this Andimitsion. That's why it's so thin and so properly folded, because the gospel sits on top, and you can see there's some wear on the top of it from where the gospel rubs on there. But one of the things that is mentioned in the prayers of preparing Holy Communion, one of the last prayers that the priest reads is this: as life-giving, more beautiful than paradise, indeed more brilliant than any royal chamber, was your tomb, O Christ, the fountainhead of our resurrection. So the tomb is that which we remember in not only in the preparation of Holy Communion, but at the celebration of the services. And if you think about, if you happen to be in church for Orthros on a Sunday, you'll notice that the priest reads from the side of the altar table, from the right side of the altar table. And that is because when the myrrh-bearing women, whom we celebrate today, went to the tomb, what does it say? It says they saw an angel standing on the right, saying what? That Christ had risen. And every single gospel reading that's read from the side of the altar table, from the side of the tomb, references the resurrection of Christ. There's 11 gospel readings that are read in order, and they rotate through. So today was 4, next week is 5, the next week is 6, all the way to 11, and then it starts over one from the gospel 1 all the way through again. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what the altar table is and the importance of the altar table. And I wanted you to know this today so that when you look at it, you realize that it is the tomb of Christ. It is the paramount object in the altar that we need to have in order to have an altar. The altar tables are never dismantled either or thrown away because they might be upgraded or because a church might move to a new facility. The altar tables are always kept and never just kind of discarded. So if you go to some churches, one particular church, St. Spiro Church, on the south side, where the church that I grew up has when the church was built, and I remember because I was there when they put in the new altar table, a big marble altar table, and the old altar table is now in a side room inside the altar, and it's used, the priests put their vestments on there when they come for the services, and then every other time of the year it's completely cleaned off, so there's nothing else on there. So it's not a place where you rest your drinks or anything like that. It's only used for liturgical services and maybe like a folding area for the priest to fold his vestments, but it's not used for anything else. It's also not in any other part of the building except for the altar. So I wanted you to just know a little bit about the altar table and realize that that's why we dress the altar table the way we do. That's why the altar table has a dress around it, and it's one of the most beautiful items in the altar, is because that is the tomb of Christ. And when we understand it to be the tomb of Christ and we realize that it's where the tomb was the representation of death and darkness and dirt and morbidity and rancidness. I mean, we look at when Lazarus was raised from the dead, when they all said, you can't don't roll away the stone because he's going to stink, right? They said there's going to be an awful odor because he's been in there for 4 days. And then when they roll away the stone, Christ is like, didn't I tell you, just listen to what I'm saying? And they roll away the stone, Lazarus comes out. But in the icon, you'll see the people have their cloths over their faces in anticipation of that odor. There's no odor in the presence of the saints. And in that tomb of Christ, imagine the beautiful aroma. Because what did they say? It was a garden around there. It was a garden, the new Garden of Eden. This new Adam, as Christ is referred to, and this beautiful symbol of death that now has become the fountainhead of our resurrection. That's why we come every single service. You come forward to receive the sacraments of the church, as we did the chrismations, as we do the baptisms, and where do we all approach? We approach the tomb of Christ. And what is in the tomb of Christ? The bones of the martyrs. But what's on top of the tomb of Christ, always, 365 days a year, is the body and blood of Christ in the reserved sacrament that resides on the altar table. And if you were to lift up the skirt of the altar table right now to look underneath, you would also see the body of Christ that goes on the cross is underneath the altar table, completely underneath the altar table, as a representation of that tomb. And at the end of the 40 days, we put Christ back on the cross and display the cross in the back of the altar. So keep that in mind. I hope this wasn't too much. I know that there's so many things that it can feather off on different questions. But if you have questions about something related to the interior of the church, or specifically what I said today, please let me know, and I'll be more than glad to answer them. But in this, the resurrection period and the rest of this liturgy, as you come forward to approach, and as we remember the myrrh-bearing women, as you come forward to receive Holy Communion today, again, approach with that same disposition that the myrrh-bearing women had, coming to the tomb to see what? To embrace the resurrected Christ and to say that Christ is risen. Christ is risen. Amen.